Hello, welcome to the somewhat delayed second episode of Cultural Capital. Our theme today is, I think, one of the trends of recent years that most fascinates me, which is the supposed return of religion. There have been a few extremely interesting surveys recently hinting at rising Christian belief among young people and also intriguing stuff about Gen Zs, especially in young adults, believing in God more than previous generations. There was another survey at the weekend which followed on some of this stuff, saying that the number of 24-year-olds who believe in God has doubled in 4 years. The headline stuff on this is a survey by the Bible Society, which found that young men going to church, I think, had quadrupled. I think is probably overstated, but it's interesting nevertheless. It seems to be a bit of a Europe-wide and perhaps West-wide phenomenon. The other really fascinating statistic is the news from France that 10,000 adults were received into the Catholic Church at Easter. I think it's 18,000 if you add in teenagers as well. So between young adults and adults, there were almost 20,000 new Catholic converts in France, which is pretty remarkable and is that's a figure that breaks records. To discuss what's going on, whether we believe this is happening, if it is happening, why, I'm joined by the writer Matt Rowland Hill, who's written about these topics very interestingly and is the author of a brilliant memoir of his very religious upbringing, Original Sins. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks, James. I've always seen you as the thinking man's Joe Rogan, so it's great to be here with you. People always say, the left needs its own Joe Rogan. No one ever says the disenchanted, pessimistic liberal centre needs its own Joe Rogan, and yet here we are.
Well, he's here. I don't know if this is necessarily going to go on at Joe Rogan-esque length, but we'll see. I'm always interested in your perspective because I think you come at this whole issue from an especially interesting angle because a lot of the commentary about this stuff comes from the secular media and people who I think are really quite removed from religion often, like certainly I am. I wasn't raised religiously. But you were raised in this intensely religious environment. You lost your faith. And I was wondering whether, to start, you could tell us a bit about your upbringing, what kind of faith you were raised with, and how that sort of fits into your journey with religion, how it's sort of changed your perspective on it.
Yeah. I'm so fascinated by this topic because, in a way, I lived through this process of secularization in the late 20th century. I was born in 1984. My dad was a evangelical Christian preacher in a Baptist church in South Wales. Me and my three siblings were raised, we believed in God, we believed in heaven and hell and devil and the angels, and the Bible was the literal word of God, and there was a talking snake, there was Adam and Eve. Our whole life was church. I went to a secular school, but religion was just the air that I breathed growing up. Then when I was a teenager, I lost my faith. It was kind of a crisis. It felt like my whole world was falling apart. And that's what I wrote about in my memoir, Original Sins. I kind of, when I look back on that, I often like to tell the story of my own loss of faith as a process of kind of coming to believe in reason and science. I read The Blind Watchmaker when I was 16, and that had an effect on me. But the truth is, it was in keeping with the times, right? Society was rapidly secularizing. My siblings, who maybe weren't reading Richard Dawkins, they also lost their faith. So that gap between my parents and their children was, it kind of represented the generation gap between religious and secular people that we've seen in this country.
It was such an interesting cultural moment, that triumph of new atheism thing. I mean, that was pretty much my intellectual coming of age. I think my first awareness of the idea that there were like writers and thinkers in the world who spread their opinions around and whose books you could buy, who discuss contemporary issues, was reading The God Illusion, was reading Christopher Hitchens' book, God Is Not Great. I think I read Sam Harris's Letter to a Christian Nation. I mean, I had pretty much the full bookshelf of those new atheist books. They obviously meant much less to me than they would have done to you. For me, it was a bit of an adolescent pose. I was raised in a totally secular environment. So I'm not really sure what I thought I was rebelling against at the age of 14. But I'm sort of interested in how important that like intellectual moment was for you. Like how important was, for instance, Richard Dawkins in you stopping being a Christian?
I did religious studies A level, and I wrote. We had to write an essay on the different arguments for the existence of God. The ontological argument, the design argument, the cosmological argument. And coming from this evangelical background, I wrote this kind of blazing polemic on behalf of the reasonableness of a belief in God. And I got a C minus, and I was I was quite a kind of academically proud teenager, and I wasn't going to have that. The teacher told me that I should go away and read The Blind Watchmaker. And I thought, who's this Richard Dawkins guy? You know, what does he know? And I started reading it one evening. I borrowed it from the school library. I started reading it one evening, and I stayed up all night reading this book. And by the morning, I was starting to feel my faith slipping away. But you know, it was also happening in the context where everyone around me in the society that I lived in was secular. I was a teenager. I was becoming interested in sex. And I think, you know, sex is a big part of the story of secularization in the 20th century, which I guess we'll get into. And maybe part of the story of the Quiet Revival as well. So, yeah, I mean, in a way, it was... I like to think that it was a battle between God and reason. Sometimes I think maybe it was more of a battle between God and sex, and there was only going to be one winner for me.
Yeah, it's an extremely interesting question. And I guess the argument I would make as a materialist is that the intellectual stuff on the surface is a bit of a froth. And what was perhaps happening to you, and to a much more irrelevant degree me, because I was raised an atheist anyway, was that we were being caught up in sort of longer term social trends that have been secularizing society since like the end of the 19th century, earlier perhaps in some countries. And yeah, I just think it's very interesting why the high point of new atheism occurred at that time, why we'd been on this sort of long secular journey, and if it is reversing, like why is it now that suddenly religion seems to be back in the air again?
So
I guess
why do you think new atheism did happen at that moment, James?
Such a good question. I mean, I think it's obviously the triumph.
Well, it was your question. You just
God. Yeah, well, I asked it to you. Okay, I think it's interesting. It was the triumph. I think it obviously comes on the back of the long-term trend towards secularization in society. I think there was a particular point in history when people were casting about for an enemy to fight. People like Christopher Hitchens were extremely eager to fight a grand intellectual battle. These are people whose fathers had fought in the Second World War. And if you look at all the books by people like Christopher Hitchens, they're kind of casting around for a big enemy. Is it Islamofascism? Is it God? Those things obviously tie together. And I think God sort of provided a perfect punching bag at that point, because I think religion still had enough of an air of authority to seem like a plausible enemy. But I think its actual authority and its actual power in society was diminished enough that you could have a go at it and nobody would object. It was very easy to agree with. It was a sort of obvious and simple enough argument that teenagers like me would come on board and feel, you know, very clever for being able to debunk the ontological argument. And I do think, I wrote this piece on the Quiet Revival for the Times, and I do think it's very strongly tied, as a couple of people suggested to me, to that end of history moment. This real feeling of optimism, this real feeling that, you know, we were solving all of society's problems, the future was going to get better. And if we could just throw off God, we're going to move to this brighter, better, richer, more sane, more just society. And I think the God thing was like probably somewhat irrelevant and symbolic. It was happening anyway, but it was quite a good like performative moment to perform that sort of Enlightenment style move to the future. I don't know, is that an analysis that would chime with you?
Yeah, well, it happened in 2006, 2007, didn't it? That's when those books were published. It was shortly after 9/11, and yeah, I think there was this kind of feeling that the West needed to kind of be muscular in defense of its liberal values, in defense of democracy and reason. And it felt like secularism was about to triumph. And then 2008 and the global financial crash happened, and everything kind of changed after that.
I think that's very true, and I guess we'll come on to this a bit, but I think in hindsight, it's a very elite movement compared to the way our culture looks now. Like the people leading it were a journalist in Christopher Hitchens who made a great show of his like elite status, his superiority. A lot of it was quite sneering towards Christians and sort of undemocratic in its tone. You know, Richard Dawkins, an Oxford professor who spent his life in universities, you know, really all these people prided themselves on their reason, their intellect, their qualifications, their belonging to an establishment. And I think your mentioning of the 2008 financial crash is a significant one, because I think this was the kind of last flourishing of that kind of post-war establishment, which set the tone in society, which could impose its views and values on people. And I think probably some of the story of the decline of that sort of new atheist fervor has been to do with the discrediting of that establishment. Not a point that I'd thought about before, but I think you're totally right. So I guess if we think we are seeing this resurgence in faith among young people, I think we are. I think it's overstated in some places. I kind of want to ask why, but I want to ask whether you think it's happening. Like, how convinced are you by these surveys and this sort of general cultural thing that Christianity is back?
Yeah, I mean, I have just been reading your brilliant article on this, and I am convinced by what you say that some of the numbers might be overstated, but in general, I believe it. It feels like it's in the air. I feel like the public reputation of religion has improved a great deal since those new atheist years that we were talking about. Nowadays, you've got cultural figures, influencers, intellectuals, people like Jordan Peterson, Ian Hersey Ali, who was an atheist and who now says she's a Christian. Joe Rogan says we need Jesus. Even Richard Dawkins says he's a cultural Christian. And it's also people on the left, right? As you said in your article, Sally Rooney, the millennial novelist. But even people like Aaron Bastani of Novara Media talks about being a Christian now. We wouldn't have heard this 15 years ago. It was seen as
and I think we just would have been unable to predict this could happen. Religion was so embarrassing in public life, and people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens used to take immense glee in pointing out that anybody who professed faith in religion, who had a public voice, how absurd it was. They used to constantly go on about, I think it was Mehdi Hassan, and they used to constantly accuse him of believing that Muhammad flew to heaven on a four-winged horse or something. And it was really kind of quite embarrassing to put your head above the parapet. I would never have imagined in my teenage fervor that God could be so like acceptable and interesting to people.
Yeah, and unless we feel too smug, I think you and I, as kind of young new atheists at the time, probably would have spoken in those terms, right?
Totally, yeah.
You know, and I very much thought of religious people as being kind of aligned with just the most retrograde form of cultural conservatism. You know, in the early the teens, gay marriage was legalized in Western countries. And it was the Christian establishment that opposed that. And you didn't want to be on their side, you know. Nowadays, it feels retrograde. It feels maybe kind of cringe or embarrassing to kind of go out and say, I'm a hard and fast atheist.
Yeah, and I think some of the new atheism movement was kind of self-debunking. It was a bit embarrassing. Do you remember? There was a particularly wonderful moment on Reddit. I think there was a movement called My Face of Atheism, which involved a lot of sort of Reddit atheists who were quite nerdy, quite weird-looking people, bravely, in inverted commas, outing themselves as atheists by posting pictures of themselves on Reddit to show that they were unafraid to show their faces as atheists. And they obviously all turned out to have sort of neckbeards and fedoras. And I think things like that somewhat dispelled some of the glamour surrounding the movement.
And do you remember when Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett decided that because atheists were a persecuted minority in Western countries, they needed a kind of a new identity, and they started styling themselves as brights because atheism was like too negative an identity. So instead, we were all going to be brights.
It's truly. I like to think that even as a teenager, I would have managed to see that was a little bit embarrassing. I'm not sure I have full confidence in that. So I think it's certainly true that part of it is just like social trends roll over. Any idea that becomes as dominant and probably as smug as new atheism became will fail to last in the culture. I don't think that's enough that, like, people who, would once have been atheist would be propelled into the arms of the church by finding Richard Dawkins or, fedora-wearing American atheists embarrassing. I guess my thesis in the article was that if this is happening, and if this long trend of secularization in the West, which as we know is like a very old one, is one of the kind of iron laws of sociology, which is that as societies modernize, they become more secular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got books on my bookshelf because I'm really interested in this topic. The kind of classic sociological texts on this have titles like "The Death of Christian Britain," "Religion's Sudden Decline," which is a book that came out a few years ago by a very eminent sociologist. So yeah, it did feel completely inevitable.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think if religious belief is returning, or belief in God is returning, or spiritual ideas are returning, I think that almost inevitably is a symptom of wider social change and a society that I think, especially for young people who are supposed to be in the vanguard of this change, really looks quite unrecognizable compared to the world that existed and people were coming of age into in the early 2000s. A lot of people I spoke to for the piece I wrote put a lot of emphasis on this idea that young people felt poorer, they felt pessimistic about their futures, they felt economically insecure, they felt the kind of material secular world wasn't like a safe, encouraging place for them to be, and that the important thing that's happened here is that as societies get richer, they secularize. Our society is kind of economically stagnating. If you're young, it basically is getting poorer. Like, you're paying an awful lot of rent. You're probably not being as well paid as your parents were relative to like the rent you're having to pay in the economy around you. I don't know, how much do you think this is an economic story? How important do you think that factor is?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk, isn't there, among right-wing figures online or right-adjacent figures about the idea that we're in a meaning crisis. Have you heard this term? Comes from a Canadian psychologist, John Vervaeke, who's got a 50-hour-long YouTube lecture series. In case you're interested in spending a lot of time,
I'm thinking possibly already put off that.
But is there a meaning crisis? I think there is, right? I've been thinking about the definition that Freud gives at one point of mental health. Someone asks him, what does mental health consist of? And he says, the ability to love and the ability to work, which I think is quite a nice definition, right? Well, let's ask, how is love and work going for Gen Z? I've written down a few stats, right? In 1990 in the United States, the number of 30-year-olds who were both married and owned a home was 52%, right? In other words, in 1990, you were more likely than not, at the age of 30, to be both married and a homeowner. Now, that figure is just over 10%. That's an enormous social change, right? People say they're lonelier than ever before. 60% of people agree with the statement, nobody really knows me. Guess what the percentage of UK men between the age of 20 and 24 who are not in work or educational training is?
God, I can't guess. I'm guessing it's going to be sort of surprisingly high.
It's 20%. One fifth of men between 20 and 24 are doing nothing with their lives. Okay? So if mental health consists of the ability to love and the ability to work, then Gen Z are not doing very well. And yeah, I do think this absolutely connects to economic conditions. People expect to be poorer than their parents, and they're right. If they don't own property, the route into kind of middle class home ownership for a young person now is almost impossible.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said. I guess another way of looking at it is, I suppose that when we were in that sort of new atheist phase, some of what we were thinking about the world after God was, we probably had a vision of what a good secular life might look like. You imagine, I think Richard Dawkins once said that the meaning of life, could be going to science lectures. And you'd imagine this sort of world in which there are various consolations for the loss of God. You maybe have a family, if that's what you want to do. you have satisfying romantic relationships. Maybe you find the kind of meaning of life in art. That's quite a common sort of theme of people looking for meaning in a post-religious environment. And I think in the 21st century, like the whole vision of a secular good life where you might have a family, own a home, do fulfilling work is like extremely unattainable. And I just think that secular society at the moment, I can see why it looks quite unattractive. I think another important theme is, I would bang on about this, but I do think that like the kind of mainstream secular culture has never been less interested in talking to people's like deeper, profounder needs, less interested in like fundamental questions of meaning. If your life is, and I think really can be the case for a lot of Gen Zs, I think the average screen time is like something ludicrous. I think it really is 9 hours. Like a lot of your life is like TikToks, Candy Crush Saga, YouTube, sort of internet doom scrolling. And that whole world, the kind of world of like secular, what would once have been culture, which is now kind of entertainment or like addictive content, I think is just not a very satisfying one. And I don't think secular culture, which once provided these like amazing works of art or poetry or novels, that if you wanted a secular meaning of life, would explain it to you and kind of give you a bit of purpose or a bit of a sense of why you're living. That just doesn't exist anymore. And I think perhaps the cultural landscape is quite arid. I know that sounds like exactly.
That is a very James Marriott
I know it's
take.
a very James Marriott take.
It's the decline of people reading Wordsworth,
Yeah,
basically.
I know. It all comes down to that. But it is also something that people genuinely did say to me. Like the sort of I say this in the piece. There's a kind of definite like unifying theme among people I spoke to who convert to Christianity. One of the important strains was like a sort of definite feeling of contempt for like secular culture, which they viewed as like trivial and embarrassing, and in the way that like new atheists once viewed religion as cringe. I think there's a little bit of a sense among some religious people that like sort of secular culture is somewhat cringe. Like it's kind of embarrassing how trivial it is and how obviously it just is unprepared or incapable of speaking to these sort of existential questions that religion has as its bread and butter.
Yeah, I read something in a Freddie de Boer essay the other day. He said something like, modern culture has failed to articulate any kind of vision of what a dignified and honourable, ordinary life could look like. The way to have self-respect or to have a good life in our society, we think of it as becoming famous, we think of it as becoming incredibly wealthy. Just an ordinary life where you can be respected by the people around you, have good connections, good relationships. That feels like increasingly unobtainable and increasingly kind of low prestige.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And you can see, I went to quite a few sort of church services for this thing, and you can see why the message of Christianity is pretty consoling. It was, sort of having, never particularly taken it seriously. And, I still don't. I'm still I haven't totally lost the Dawkins-like teenage atheist in me. It's really interesting to be reminded of how powerful that message sounds. God loves you. We're all equal. We're all equal in the eyes of God. We all have meaning and purpose. You all matter.
Yeah.
I sort of hearing that in a modern context was really quite striking, and you could see why that has been a powerful message. And not to get into sort of whole theories of cultural evolution, but it's lasted for a reason. It's managed to sort of, as Richard Dawkins would say, mimetically propel itself through the generations and reproduce itself. And yeah, I think if it's needed, that's a message that can suddenly seem quite attractive.
Yeah, I think about this song that we used to sing in church all the time. I don't know if it's still popular now, but it was called "What a Friend I Found," and the lyrics went, "What a friend I found, closer than a brother, more intimate than lovers, Jesus, friends forever." And if you're a lonely, aimless young person now, if you're one of those men who's not in work, education or training, and you're spending all your time online all day, that's a really attractive message to hear.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I think we need to talk as well about, we've been talking about the kind of demand side of...
Yes, this is exactly what I was going to raise. And this is a point that you made to me, and I think it's a very good one. Go on.
So, you can think about the rise in interest in Christianity as kind of having both a sort of demand and a supply side. The demand comes from everything we've just been talking about: economic problems, isolation. There's COVID as well, right, which kind of leads to a declining prestige of science. But on the supply side, people are much more exposed to a diversity of worldviews now than they would have been 20 or 30 years ago because of the internet and social media. You know, in the late 20th century, there was basically a kind of monopoly of existential worldviews. It was liberal secularism, or if you like, there was a duopoly. It was sort of like Apple and Samsung. You know, you've got liberal secularism or old-fashioned Christianity. Now there's a whole kind of panoply of different worldviews that you're exposed to all the time on social media. Different kinds of spirituality, different sort of mental health discourse, and yeah, Christianity. You know, so someone who was raised in an entirely secular house 30 years ago, it was going to be quite hard for them to come into contact with Christian ideas, you know. Nowadays, you know, you turn on your phone and you've got Jordan Peterson talking about it. So people are more exposed to that stuff. The interesting thing as well is that the kind of the supply and the demand sort of work together in a way, because I think while these devices are sort of isolating us and contributing to the contributing to the reasons that people are feeling lost and lacking in meaning, it then kind of comes and supplies an answer through these kind of right-wing influences.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. I think you used the phrase to me when we were talking about this before, like there was a kind of secular media hegemony, and I think it's really true. Like I just think there probably wasn't really much room or much space in the mainstream media, especially in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. The BBC, I think, in the immediate post-war era had kind of pushed some Christian content. But after that, I mean, it really was the dominant worldview was secular and rational. You know, I now feel pretty nostalgic for that time. And if you wanted, you know, a spiritual side of life or an irrational side of life, it's very unlikely that the BBC or the mainstream newspapers were going to platform those kinds of voices in any major way at all. And the idea you'd have someone like Jordan Peterson, whose entire worldview is essentially a kind of spiritualized one or quasi-spiritual one. And it's not just like a little slot at the side that says, here's the Christian moment. It sort of invests his whole view of life. I just don't think that was available on, you just couldn't hear that anywhere in the mainstream press and on Radio 4. And I don't know where else you were going to get these ideas from. I think also there was a really important sort of, some interesting work on religion and the spread of religious ideas has kind of dwelt on the importance of like prestige. And I think the message pushed by the BBC and newspapers in that post-war era was that the rationalist enlightenment, in inverted commas, atheist position was the prestigious one. If you want to be a prestigious person in society, these were the prestigious views. I'm sure like a lot of this played into my own teenage atheism. You know, I very much, as a teenager, somewhat embarrassing, I was really quite keen to feel like I belonged to an intellectual establishment, an intellectual elite. And I'm sure part of my atheism was that I had received these messages saying, all the really smart people are atheists. If you want to be smart, you have to adopt this set of views. You know, every expert, every comedian who was cool was like, you know, sort of probably making jokes about the Church of England at some point. And I think that was probably, you know, and if I was a religious person, I'd probably be quite angry about that in hindsight, because I think, you know, those religious voices just couldn't get a word in edgeways. I mean, I obviously now feel pretty nostalgic about it.
And talking about religious voices starting to get a hearing again, I'm curious to ask you, what do you think the influence of the ideas of Tom Holland are here?
I think I think he's actually remarkably influential, given that his book Dominion is a very long book. His name came up a lot talking to people for this piece. I'm not necessarily sure that like all the people who've converted to Christianity who I spoke to have read Dominion, his book about Christianity, have perhaps even heard of it. But I do think that the thesis of that book, which is that our Western secular society is founded, without our knowing it, often without our understanding it, on a kind of bedrock of Christian belief. So, you know, our ideas of secularism, he says, or liberal ideas of the value of individual life, these are basically Christian ideas in disguise. I mean, I think he's basically right. I think it's, you know, it's a great book. And I think the role that idea plays, and I think it's very widespread, even among people who aren't necessarily aware they're getting it from Tom Holland, is that if there is this idea that our society is broken, that something's missing, that liberal society has provided us with a lot of good things, but this meaning thing, this gaping hole at the heart of it, that we can't work out what we're missing, the answer given by Dominion is Christianity. And definitely among the more thoughtful people I spoke to, that book came up. certainly among like every kind of priest I spoke to or clergyman, they mentioned what they called the Tom Holland effect.
Yeah, I mean,
There's an interesting
it's such a
speech
kind of
by...
sorry.
Go on.
Well, it's such a powerful kind of argument in sort of turning the argument back on atheists, isn't it? Because it says, atheists used to say, if you want to be liberal, if you want to believe in democracy, if you want to believe in human rights, you have to reject religion. But Tom Holland's kind of saying, actually, if you want to defend those things, you almost need to be a Christian, or at least that's how his argument is interpreted by a lot of people online.
Yes, exactly. And I think that if there's this ambient cultural sense that we live in a culture that's missing something at the heart of it, what that Tom Holland idea does, whether you're getting it from the book or via a podcast or whatever, is say, oh, the thing we're missing is Christianity. And it's very kind of powerfully chimes with the time. I think it also has extra resonance with like a kind of conservative Christianity, which I do think is a very important part of this, in inverted commas, quiet revival. I sometimes think it might be the major part. There was an interesting speech that went viral by a Conservative MP called Danny Kruger online a few weeks ago. And the substance of his speech was that Britain is like a Christian nation. I think he called it a community of common worship, founded on Christian values. All our sort of, every value that we treasure is a Christian one. And that if we're going to protect Britain and British values, we need a Christian restoration. I mean, you hear versions of this on GB News as well. Like, I think some of it is like a somewhat sort of, benign, nostalgic conservatism for the lost values of the past. I certainly think a fair bit of it is sharpened by a feeling that our Western civilization is like under threat from wokeness or Islam, both mentioned by Danny Kruger in his speech. Ayaan Hirsi Ali also mentions those ideas in her essay, Why I Am Now a Christian, her kind of essay describing her reconversion. How important do you think that sort of right-wing take on those sort of like fundamental Christian values ideas is?
Yeah, I'm sure Tom Holland is like a nice liberal Democrat, but these ideas are really popular among people who are who are concerned about immigration and wokeness, aren't they? I mean, there's another aspect to all of this, which is just that Christianity has become so weak that it's no longer a threat to anybody's kind of lifestyles or values, right? In the past, if you'd gone to church, there's a real risk that the preacher's going to tell you to stop having sex with your girlfriend, right? Now, I don't think that that's very likely. I think Christianity has probably adapted. It's kind of lost that battle with our sort of contemporary sexual morality, and now, yes, churches are going to be soft peddling kind of conservative sexual ethics. They're going to be generally pro-marriage, but they're not going to tell you to move out of your cohabiting situation with your girlfriend.
No, I don't think so. And I think that's what's so interesting about your particular story of your religious upbringing, which is, I think, among secular people who perhaps are nostalgic for religion and tend to idealize it, they kind of forget the sorts of, incredibly intense experiences that you can have being brought up religious. The very strict moral codes, the sort of old-fashioned literalistic interpretations of the Bible, the kind of stuff the new atheists railed against. I think some of that has been forgotten. And I certainly think there is an extent to which the role that Christianity has adopted now is that it's just another identity you can assume. In our kind of liberal, identity-obsessed society, a religious identity is now one that you can take on. I think especially for people coming from the right who live in this world of like identity claims. If you want to kind of make your case, or you want to claim you need special treatment, you have to make a claim about your particular identity background and like what you deserve because of your identity. And I think part of it is them thinking, well, we need an identity as like, white Christians that we can claim as our own and that we can sort of use a launch pad for our ideas and our, the things we want from culture. I certainly think that's part of it.
Yeah, and, religion can only be an identity if you are a minority, right? And a lot of these Christian influencers, they talk about wanting to see kind of Christianity return to a place in our national life where it sort of provides the kind of underpinning for our shared values. But in a strange way, this rise in Christianity that we seem to be seeing sort of depends on liberal culture, because it depends on people being able to kind of make the choice to be countercultural, being able to be weird, being able to go online and talk about how they identify and who they are. So there's that kind of paradoxical aspect to it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it plays into another thing. And I think this is maybe where, we think this probably is happening, that people are becoming more Christian. There's a skeptical account of the Quiet Revival which says that Christianity is shrinking in this country. I mean, that is also simultaneously true, I think. The last census, Christianity was a minority religion in Britain for the first time since, the 7th, 6th century or something. And the sort of the skeptical thesis of the Quiet Revival is that what's happening is that now that Christianity is a minority religion, it's kind of lost a lot of the obligations that a mainstream national church has to the population at large. If you're the church for everyone, you're kind of forced into all kinds of compromises for this basically secular society. You have to represent, you can't be old-fashioned about women priests or gay marriage or, I think even some of the kind of liturgical ritual stuff, there was a movement in the Church of England in the early 2000s to play down because this was a church that wanted to represent everyone, and therefore it had to be as much like secular society as possible. I think any sociologist would tell you that for any kind of movement that hopes to sustain itself in society, that's a disaster. You just melt back into society. And we know, I think from various studies, that the movements that tend to propagate themselves and last are ones that have strong in-group identities, either through strong moral codes that people can adhere to, or through strange rituals by which people can distinguish themselves from everyone else. And I think these two things are simultaneously true. Christianity has lost its obligations to the whole of society. Nobody believes that Britain is a Christian nation anymore. Most people in Britain no longer describe themselves as Christians. Therefore, it's actually quite fortuitous for Christianity, I guess, because it's now quite well equipped to appeal to this online world, which is very much made up of subcultures, of niches, of common, minority interest groups, which there are all kinds of people with weird opinions online finding one another. And I think this new status as a minority religion has come at potentially just the right time for Christianity.
Why do you think society was secularizing so? Why did secularization happen in the first place?
I mean, I think I do tend to kind of always think that you should default to the materialist explanation of things. I think I broadly buy the idea that as societies get richer and people become more economically secure, they become more secular because in terms of existential comfort, which is what people have always sought from religion, the idea that you're going to be economically secure. What's your view of why society was getting more secular up until recently?
So when I was a new atheist, I probably would have thought about it in terms of the triumph of reason and science, right? The Enlightenment happened, Darwin happened. It took people a little while to catch on, but eventually people en masse started accepting that the scientific worldview was superior to the religious worldview, and we were all becoming gradually more rational, and soon God would be dead forever. I think that was kind of the idea that I had, and that was sort of the idea that underpinned New Atheism. When I think about it now, I do think that the economic explanation that you talk about in your piece makes much more sense. You said that rising prosperity leads to secularization. I think that's right. The only nuance I would add there is that I think rising prosperity leads to a change in people's values. So instead of valuing family life and all those values that kind of lead to what sociologists sometimes talk about as pro-fertility norms. So you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage, gay people shouldn't have sex, sex should be about procreation. As people feel their survival is secure, they turn to individualistic values. They want to express themselves. They want to find themselves. They want to have an identity. And I think there's kind of two things. There's the creation of the welfare state in the post-war years that makes people feel economically more secure and that leads to rising prosperity. And then there's also the invention of the pill in 1960s, which really kind of sort of supercharges these individualistic norms and allows people to live these kind of this sort of liberal lifestyle. So, the scientific worldview had been available for a long time, but it was only with changing economic conditions that secularism really took off. Well, one thing I would say is that I kind of think that the conditions that created secularism and individualism, and those two things are kind of almost synonymous in the late 20th century. I think by the kind of late 20th century, they start to sort of, individualism starts to kind of undermine the conditions that created it. So you see declining trust in society and you see rising inequality, and that makes people feel less secure. And that kind of leads to this backlash against secularism that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I totally buy that. I think it's a topic to which there are probably almost infinite answers, and I think some are more correct than others. I think everything you've said probably constitutes the main answer to that question. There have been a couple of other interesting things that people have thrown at me in the course of writing that article. The writer Louise Perry said to me that she thinks that some of it is to do with the massive decline in child mortality since the 19th century. I think it's quite an interesting idea that maybe we don't grasp how emotionally and existentially bewildering and depressing it was to be confronted with the endless death of children, which if you were a parent before the era of modern medicine was a routine fact of life. And it's almost a cliche of 18th century and 19th century novels that there'll be some sort of you'll be a mother and maybe living a somewhat kind of fast lifestyle, and then you'll lose your kid and you'll become religios and off to church all the time and constantly praying to God for salvation. And I do wonder if, because we live in this scientific, very medically advanced society to a degree that we take it for granted, we kind of forget the impact that basically the banishing of pain and death from most of our everyday lives has a real kind of existential impact on us. I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, I was very struck reading Robin Dunbar's book about the evolution of religion, that the first evidence that we have of religion in human history are burial sites where there's this ancient burial site, I think in northern Israel, where a 12-year-old child has been buried with all these possessions. And the thinking goes that the people who buried him must have believed in an afterlife, because why would you give precious possessions when you're a hunter-gatherer tribe? Why would you bury them with a child unless you thought he was taking them to the afterlife? And I think that probably is a kind of an eternal part of the human condition. Even when you solve so many of the kind of existential problems of life, like late 20th century welfare states did, even when life expectancy becomes much longer, when infant mortality goes down, when we don't have to worry about crops failing and plague, and we even start to worry much less about war because there's this long period of peace after World War II. We are still the only animal that dies, and we have to think about our mortality. And it's in those moments in life that people kind of turn to religion. So even in very secular societies, people still want religious funerals. They still want to mark births and deaths by turning to the gods. And I think for that reason, even in the most secular society, we probably can't kind of banish religion altogether.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think so much religious language seeps in around death, even among people who would consider themselves otherwise impeccably secular. People just can't help talking about, your grandma's and she's looking down on you. Oh, she's out there somewhere. It's a theme of, if you look at cards that people would, the funeral card array in your local card shop, is full of these sorts of sentiments, and nobody finds it weird, because I bet a lot of the people buying these cards are not religious people, and if you questioned them on their like view of how the universe operates scientifically, they wouldn't bring up any of this stuff, and yet it's there. Doesn't Robin Dunbar say in his book that he thinks that the sort of intuition that the life lives on beyond the body in some way is like basically universal to humans? Isn't that part of his argument?
Yeah, I think that's something that comes up in other writers. There's a psychologist called Paul Bloom who's studied the idea that humans are like innate dualists. We seem to separate the world into physical objects and minds, and even very young children do this. And if you have that way of looking at reality, then it becomes very natural to think that the mind can survive the body. Actually, this really connects to why I became interested in religion again. I lost somebody very close to me. My brother died suddenly, and I'd considered myself a kind of absolutely convinced rationalist. And when I was going through that period of grief after losing my brother, I kept having the thought again and again that, well, of course he's not really gone. Of course he must be coming back. It was like, I was absolutely 100% convinced that death is the end. There was no afterlife. And yet I couldn't seem to quite kind of convince my pre-rational mind of that. And when I think about that, it makes me realize that the sort of contemptuous new atheist attitude towards religion is just so kind of out of step with ordinary human nature. I think, religion, spirituality, superstitious ideas are just completely ineradicable in human beings. And what do you think? I mean, do you think human beings are kind of naturally religious?
I don't know if naturally religious is putting it too strongly, but I think I'm persuaded from what I've read that supernatural ideas do seem to be part of human nature, or like a very easily accessible part of human nature. One of the really interesting things I found writing that piece for the Times was that obviously my instinct is to analyze all of this in purely cultural and political terms. And I kept saying to people, what attracted you to church? Was it the music? Was it the lovely rituals? Was it the sort of existential comfort of the idea that there's an all-powerful God who loves you? And I sort of was kind of always trying to analyze this in like political or cultural or economic terms. And not inevitably, but quite often I was told, oh no, I was praying and I heard the voice of Jesus, or I was praying and I had like a sense of the like presence of God. Not answers, obviously, that I'd prepared to hear at all. And it was all, people often, I think, felt slightly awkward saying this to me because it was clearly something I'd not assumed I was about to hear from them. But I heard this enough times that I was kind of persuaded that there is this aspect of human nature that is probably not well catered for in our modern secular society. Like, if you are the kind of person, and I think I'm probably persuaded there's like, it's a constant in human history that have always been, perhaps it's a minority of people, perhaps even quite a small minority of people who've had like these sort of religious experiences. And those impulses don't really have anywhere to go in a modern secular society. They're embarrassing and wrong, and we're quite contemptuous of them. And I can sort of see that if we are in this phase where the like social acceptability of religion is increasing, some of that irrational part of human nature maybe has a bit more of an expression.
Yeah, it's just totally normal for people to think like everything happens for a reason, and people just aren't really thinking about the kind of metaphysics of that when they say it. I think it's another thing. One of the things that New Atheism got wrong about religion, they sort of had the idea that this was really about kind of competing beliefs. I don't think people really hold their beliefs very strongly. In fact, I think there's evidence from social psychologists that religious people, they sort of sign up to a set of beliefs and then they have to work pretty hard to kind of maintain them. Actually, we can all kind of change our worldviews very easily. And I think that supernatural thinking just sort of comes in very readily for people. And if you give them permission to express those beliefs, they will. I mean, actually, Paul Bloom's got a paper, a psychology paper called "Would Tarzan Believe in God?" And he's sort of asking, like, would a human being who didn't grow up among other humans, who didn't have culture, would he believe in God? And actually, Paul Bloom concludes he wouldn't believe in a he wouldn't believe in a Christian God. He wouldn't be a monotheist, but he'd probably be a polytheist. He'd believe in spirits in the trees and the woods and the rivers.
Yeah, I think that sounds totally true. I think this is a point made by Robin Dunbar. I think Robert Wright maybe makes it also in his book, The Evolution of God, that we have a natural tendency as human beings to assign intention to inanimate objects. We're extremely sociable animals, and in our evolutionary environment, working out the intention of the people around you was a matter of life and death. If you're going to succeed in a social band, which was your only path to survival in our prehistory, you had to be incredibly aware of the intentions of the people around you, what they wanted to do, what they meant, what they were going to do next. And we have this kind of hyperactive intention discerning mechanism, I think is the argument. And therefore, that sort of overfunctions, and we see intention everywhere. We see it in trees, we see it in clouds, we see it in thunder, we see it in unexpected accesses of sunlight. And that, I mean, as people say, this seems to be the foundation of early or inverted commas primitive animist religions. These aren't religions necessarily saying there's a God that rules the universe. These are religions saying, there's a God in that tree, there's a God in that stone. And I think that kind of religion probably becomes, it's probably quite natural to maybe all human beings.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of religious people now like to argue that we're naturally religious because basically all human societies have been religious until quite recently. Maybe we are in a sense, but we're probably not naturally religious. We're probably not naturally inclined to the kind of monotheistic religion where you've got a God who's interested in your moral conduct, who sends you to heaven or hell at the end of your life. Those ideas seem to be associated with the rise of agriculture in human societies, right? So anthropologists think that basically we didn't have those kinds of gods at all for almost all of our evolutionary history. And it might be that the kind of woo-woo spirituality that is more popular nowadays, and that's maybe a sort of rival to the rise of Christianity among young people, is closer to the sort of religion that our prehistoric ancestors practiced. So maybe we're not kind of naturally religious in the sense of going to church. Maybe we're more naturally superstitious or naturally spiritual.
And that's such an interesting idea, which I guess kind of brings us to the sort of final thing that perhaps we should address, which is, what do you think the future of religious belief looks like in Britain? If you were to come back in 100 years' time, 200 years' time, what do you think that religious environment might look like? Do you think it's a full-on restoration of Christianity in Britain? Do you think it's this more individualistic woo-woo style thing? What do you think that looks like?
Well, because I think, I agree with you that these things are driven by material conditions. I think material conditions for young people don't look good. And I don't see that things are kind of getting better in the West. I don't see us returning to a situation of kind of long-term economic growth. And I also know that social scientists say that religion is associated with inequality. People are more likely to be religious in unequal societies. So I expect people to lose faith in, to continue losing faith in the kind of liberal, secular, scientific worldview. And yeah, if material reality isn't working for people, then people will become interested in things beyond the material. I think the idea that Christianity is going to kind of fill that void seems very unlikely to me. It seems like Christianity is likely to be kind of like one small weird spiritual culture, subculture among many. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm basically inclined to agree with you. I think Christianity has a future. It's partly because it has this extraordinary spiritual infrastructure. So much of what you hear about what gets people through the door of a church is that I had this spiritual impulse, I was looking for something to do with it, and there's this unbelievably beautiful building nearby that felt very spiritual, that felt like it was a place where you could address serious things. And Christianity has this enormously rich cultural heritage a whole series of answers to the kinds of questions we're talking about. I agree that I would be very surprised. I'd be amazed if Britain ever becomes like a Christian nation in the way that it was 100 years ago, even. But I sort of think that Christianity will be a part of the story. I mean, I think there are all kinds of interesting things that people have said to me. One quite interesting idea, and I think maybe not an implausible one, is that the main thing will be this sort of more individualistic kind of belief that you talk about. So things like some weird personal mix of like Buddhism, meditation, particular kind of therapy, maybe some kind of weird dietary practice about avoiding certain foods, spiritual dancing. There are all kinds of these, if you're in London, you hear about all kinds of this sort of stuff. And that maybe Christianity will be a part of that mix. Like maybe you would think of yourself as a Christian, maybe you wouldn't, but maybe you would have, like people go around with these bracelets with like saints or the Virgin Mary on, and maybe that would be something that's sort of like just in the mix of a much more sort of individualistic, personalized spiritual life. I could sort of believe that. I think the other interesting factor, which I guess we kind of touched on, which is I'm just not sure. This is what sort of makes me think our future is more irrational. Is that I just don't think the secular, rational worldview that you and I grew up with, and that we were probably partly attracted to because of its prestige and its intellectual prestige. I'm not sure that prestige attracts that worldview anymore. As I kind of was saying at the beginning, I think it's probably kind of slightly associated with a somewhat discredited, like academic, scientific establishment towards whom a lot of people feel very hostile or disillusioned in. And, the sort of rise of these Christian influences is fascinating because what another kind of important theory about the spread of religion is this thing called, I think it's the demographer Alice Evans coined this term, the prestige-piety feedback loop, to describe the revival in Islam in the Middle East in the 1990s. And that was because this sort of became a prestigious thing to be Muslim, and that attracted more people to it because status is such an important driver of human behavior. And I think if I don't think that society will look completely secular in 100 years' time, it's because I think that secular worldview has really lost its prestige and has lost its sort of prestigious propagators in society, who were people like me in the old mainstream media, who would never mention religion and would laugh at it and say that science was the main thing. And I just don't think that dynamic exists in society anymore.
Yeah. Although talking about the propagation of religion, there is a wrinkle in all of this, isn't there? Which is that secularism leads to declines in fertility. When people become non-religious, they become less interested in having children, and it's religious people who have more kids. So, there is a possibility that we end up in a kind of society where it's the religious people who have children and then pass on their religion, and we know religion is partly heritable.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it's kind of actually, if you look at the demographics of this, all these kinds of amazing studies where on current demographic trends, obviously it would be ridiculous to expect them to continue ad infinitum. The Amish will be a majority of the American population by 300 years' time, just because their fertility is so high and secular fertility is so low. And I sort of think, in a way, that demographic fact, which will work its way out one way or another, I think, and the idea that religious people are much more fertile than secular people seems irrefutable. That may be the overwhelming thing here, and everything we're speculating about, will the kinds of people who are like secular East Londoners who are into like woo-woo therapies and special dancing and like Buddhism, does that category of person even exist anymore if those sorts of people aren't reproducing themselves, and therefore maybe the future is like Christian or Muslim or Amish or something like that.
Before we go, Jay, I feel like we've been talking about this in a very kind of cold, materialistic way, but
Good.
I'm just curious about. I'm just curious. I mean, for you, I mean, could you ever be tempted by religion? Are you in any way a kind of spiritual person, or do you not have a spiritual bone in your body?
I fundamentally think that my worldview is just too bleak. I just can't help but view religion as a kind of, sort of special, a sort of unreasonable optimism and a sort of license to believe that the universe is a happier place and a safer place because you want it to be. I think we're all just chemicals and atoms and electric signals washing around in huge bags of flesh, which I know is quite depressing, but I think it's true. And I think also, if you're not going to be religious, the responsible thing is to like really, I think you have to embrace the void. You have to accept that the world is meaningless, and it's embarrassing to try and strike a halfway point. So I think you've got to lean into the nihilism personally. Have you found yourself remotely tempted by? Could you ever be tempted back to Christianity or any other kind of religious or spiritual belief?
Well, I'm very. I find it very interesting that happiness research shows that religious people are happier than non-religious people, right? But there's the question, like, why is that? Is that to do with their beliefs, or is that to do with the kind of community that they belong to? And it turns out that the non-religious spouses of religious people get the same happiness benefit from religion than that true believers do. So that suggests that it's the kind of community. So if you're a kind of non-religious free rider on a religious community, you get to have the kind of happiness benefit without the supernatural beliefs. And in a way, I think I kind of am that person, because I go to support groups for 12-step support groups for addiction. In those groups, people talk about a higher power, people talk about having a spiritual awakening. I kind of don't really believe in any of it, but I'm very much sort of part of that community. I'm sort of a free rider on people's spiritual beliefs. And, in a sense, you could say that as a result of that, I am a religious person. I'm a member of a religious community. I don't have the metaphysical beliefs, but in a way, maybe it's a kind of Protestant idea that you have to have a sort of strong commitment to a set of supernatural beliefs to count yourself a member of a religion. There's lots of people that we would call religious who sort of don't have those beliefs. Lots of Jewish people sort of don't have strong supernatural beliefs. Buddhists too. So maybe in that sense, I kind of am religious. And maybe when we think about the future of religion in the West, it's that sort of religion that's based on community and shared ritual, that could survive.
Yeah, I really think that's persuasive. And I guess Tom Holland would remind us that our whole idea of religion is shaped by our experience of Christianity, which I think, when it was born as a religion, was quite unique in expecting its adherents to hold to a body of doctrine. This was not the case in ancient Roman religion. As you say, religion was ritual. The religion of Hinduism is, as people often say, the invention of Westerners who want to kind of describe this body of practices and beliefs as a kind of coherent doctrine. That's actually quite alien. And for a lot of people, as you say, the foundation of religion is ritual, not ascribing to a set of beliefs. I think that's a very persuasive vision of what the future might look like.
But I just want to ask you one more thing, James, because just a minute ago you were describing yourself as a nihilist who wants to embrace the void, right? But just can you tell viewers of Cultural Capital, what does James Marriott, the nihilist and hardcore atheist, do when he sees a magpie?
Yeah, no, this is true. This is my great spiritual weakness. As I'm extremely superstitious, in spite of the fact that I technically believe it's all bollocks. But you have seen me salute magpies and recite the rhyme to them to protect myself from bad luck.
So what
which
is it?
I'm ashamed to admit, but there it is.
So if you see two magpies, that's good luck.
That's fine. That's good luck. Yeah, a single magpie genuinely will somewhat upset my emotional equilibrium for about 5 minutes.
And I have actually seen you do this. On some level, you really believe that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. It's true what you say, which is that this idea that like a set of beliefs is something you adhere to non-stop, and at any given moment you ask someone what they believe, they'll say it's true. The magpie thing lasts about as long as I see a magpie, and then it disappears, and I feel vaguely humiliated by it. But yeah, it is true. I think this is the outlet for all my spiritual beliefs. I hope it doesn't metastasize beyond that. I think it's a quite safe box to put my spiritual impulses in.
Or maybe it spreads through society and it becomes viral and everyone starts taking up the weird kind of magpie rhyme religion.
Yeah, maybe I become the leader of the... Yeah, maybe I become the leader of the magpie cult. And, well, probably I think we have to hope that doesn't happen. And I think on that somewhat surreal note, I'll say thanks very much for coming on the podcast and revealing my dark spiritual secret. And there will be a third episode of Cultural Capital, no doubt, eventually. But it could take a while to arrive due to sort of generalized logistical problems with me organizing these things. But thank you
Okay,
for
we're
watching.
both off to worship some magpies.